Honestly, I wanted to release this video a lot later because I think it deserves a lot more context. You see, you can't even imagine true autisticness even if you're autistic. The entire imagination of the world cannot guess autisticness. Whatever I explain here will be uncountably less than what I could have explained, and what I could have explained is uncountably less than what I'm observing and inferring. However, I don't think many people would listen anyway, unless I get rid of the fear first. You see, the term autistic itself is a pretty big misnomer, because it comes from autos, by oneself. The assumption is that autistic people are unsocial, and it is the double empathy studies that debunk this formally, but do not listen to the connotations of that. The only evidence that autistic people were actually unsocial comes from behaviorism, which is to say, there was no evidence at all. Although the repression is so intense that it's hard to get back, all autistic people nonetheless knew that they were social. And it's only after everyone told them otherwise that they didn't. So anyone could have realized the autistic Neanderthal theory, or at the very least that autistic people had origins in an autistic society. At the very least, there has to be at least some explanation for why autistic people exist. Otherwise, with double empathy, you would have autistic people who could communicate with autistic people, but without an autistic society, autistic people would just be replaced by neurotypicals that happen to be very intelligent and have very good memory. And autistic people suffer a lot in the diaspora. In fact, I'm calling it the hyperdiaspora because you don't even have a society anymore. But autistic people did still thrive. We don't actually have that much evidence before a certain point of time, but we do know that autistic people were more than capable of having families. We know that autistic people didn't suffer major unemployment, and autistic people did not suffer loneliness as much. As a matter of fact, a lot of the scientists and intellectuals like Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton were themselves autistic. However, it wasn't before neoliberalism and behaviorism that you start to see a decline in the autistic population, and a pretty steep decline. Loneliness among autistic people. Lack of high but stable income for autistic people. Autism awareness only made this worse by completely obscuring those issues. Autistic people would actually be focused on that. Even if autistic people weren't even aware of that, that's what everyone would be thinking about. But instead, autism awareness has used agenda control to shift our attention to more petty problems like the autism epidemic, which isn't even a real thing. However, to be fair, there is an epidemic of ABA, which is probably making autistic people nonverbal by virtue of instilling learned helplessness. For generations, it is autism awareness that has dominated the intellectual scene, that has dominated the narrative regarding autistic people. My original praxis was looking for scientific articles that prove the opposite of what autism awareness was saying, that autistic people were unsocial, that autistic people weren't intelligent and lacked executive functioning. However, I've come to realize that there is no science, there is no psychology, there is no evidence proving one side or the other, because they're all corrupted by the autism awareness perspective. On a side note, merely mentioning the notion that autistic people lack executive functioning is very dangerous because it's dehumanizing and nobody's even questioning it, so it's very easy to believe. I should do a separate video on this, but let me say that you can debunk it softly by realizing that there's no scientific evidence for this, that autistic adults lack executive functions. And even if there were, then you would still be left with only one context. And even if there was science proving it to be at least plausible, it would ignore the larger context and complexity. Now, I've come to realize that science can only answer a fraction of questions regarding psychology, and the actual science isn't important in debates usually. It usually boils down to what you assume. But the stuff that Autism Speaks assumes is pretty terrible, pretty insane. Like, they'll say stuff like, oh, almost all of autistic people are nonverbal. Oh, all autistic people have an average cost of $60,000 a year. Now, a lot of these claims may be backed up by pseudoscience or reject science altogether. You know, they'll often not cite their sources or just make up something out of thin air. But it makes no difference if they use a little bit of science, because you can bastardize science to the point where it doesn't actually mean anything, and they have. There's one example that really shows how far they are willing to go. You know 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤, the autistic person supposedly so disabled that he inspired Autism Speaks. Well, I don't think he exists, or at the very least, he's faking his disability just so that the grandparents can go on their ego trip. And that's because of two conflicting facts, or at least two sets of conflicting facts, between the interview with Katie Wright that was done in 2007 and Sounding the Alarm by Autism Speaks in 2014. In the former, 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤 was said to be born in August 31st, 2001. And in the latter, 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤 was said to have been born August 31st, 2002, 2 instead of 1. And in the Katie Wright interview, she said that 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤 was getting quote-unquote language back. Now, I don't believe that anyway, because he was getting language back supposedly from ABA. To be fair, she could have lied, and something else gave him language, and she's just lying about that. But the point is that she's lying about something, because in the 2014 documentary, we see 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤 incapable of making phrases and sentences. And it's not to say that he has cognitive deficits, but it's probably sensory motor deficits. Now, there are a lot of ways to explain the inconsistencies, so that's why I'm gonna say it's a conspiracy theory, not a conspiracy fact. However, the point is that they're willing to lie about something so simple. If they're willing to lie about their own son, they're gonna lie about millions of autistic people that they're never going to see. If you've seen a ridiculous quote-unquote fact from Autism Awareness and you would like to debunk it quite easily, then I would love to hear it in the comments. But the point isn't relating to any particular fact or set of facts, but the general wisdom that Autism Awareness almost always lies. Recently, Autism Awareness has been trying to target autistic people a lot more directly, which is a big problem because, first of all, they are behaviorists. Autistic people cannot embrace behaviorism, or else autistic people will be without society and go extinct. But it's also dangerous because now they're trying to ease you into believing that you are unsocial, that you lack executive functioning, but they also want you to feel comfortable because at least you can invent things, at least you're paying attention to details. Keep in mind that if they were telling the truth, that would help autistic people, and they've established quite strongly that they want to quote-unquote treat and cure quote-unquote autism, and it's hard to do that when autism is running amok. It is very safe to assume that autistic people have greater executive functioning, have greater socialization in terms of theory of mind and communication, and that autistic people have, well, I will admit that autistic people are probably better at inventing and quote-unquote detailed orientation, but autistic people do not specialize in that. And autistic people have at least stricter morality, and all of them are only untrue outside of an autistic society. Now, it's ideal for me to go deeper into the science to show that this is all plausible, and I will in another video, but the point is that all of these are safe to assume, because first of all, even without internalized autism awareness, these would be impossible to prove or disprove. It is most important to point out that science, especially the science we have right now, cannot discover what the individual mind is actually like in nature, much less right now. Ultimately, you are just going to have to assume most things, but what makes one assumption better than others? It could be because if autistic people aren't especially social and lack personality, then there's nothing for autistic people to specialize in anyway. It could also be because the world right now needs a stronger society, not technology. So if autistic people aren't good at that, then autistic people don't deserve power anyway. And for clarification, I mean power over the world as a whole. It could also be because it's the less fearful option, and it promotes a lack of insecurity. The more you read the literature and media of autism awareness, the more you realize it's mean-spirited, like in the exact same way that a lot of transphobic, racist, sexist media is. Psst, you don't have any sense of society or culture. You need cards to teach you basic social etiquette. You're not a grown-up, you need real adults to teach you how to live your life. You don't deserve family, children, or stable income, much less friendship. I'm barely even parodying them, I'm just taking out the aesthetic, which makes it sound politically correct or whatever. A lot of us try to separate the facts from the feelings, but effectively, that's not really possible, because there is so much information that you do need to be at least aware of the source. And if they're being so mean-spirited, that makes them much less trustworthy, because putting someone down, making them feel insecure, is almost a surefire way to gaslight them. And you know, it's not like the behaviorists are doing anything good themselves. Oh, and speaking of fear, another reason could very well be that someone needs to question what autism awareness is saying, even if they did actually care about autistic people. All this time, I was trying to prove that autistic people were valid through science, but I've realized that I've already known this. I remember being so upset being in a card-based society. Now, I couldn't say this explicitly because I didn't realize how toxic card-based society was, because I didn't really have any other frame of reference, you know? But I remember being so annoyed that I was cooped up in my house and, I couldn't even go outside. And that really bothered me, especially as a kid. I also remember how hard it was to make friends under a military family. I remember that I would move so often, it was like I'd move every year. From kindergarten to third grade, I probably was forced to move like 5 times, something like that. I can go on and on about how I personally was sensitive to Adamite society, but my actual point is that autistic people already know that they're social, already know that autism awareness is complete nonsense. I originally tried using science to justify autistic people, to validate autistic people, but all we're actually doing by doing that is justifying autistic people outwardly to non-autistics. We all knew at some point, but it was beaten out of us through society. Because let's be honest, almost everyone believes that autistic people are unsocial, even autistic people. Now, if you're rich or famous, you're extra responsible to be skeptical of what you hear. So when I see these autistic YouTubers saying, or rather assuming, that autistic people lack theory of mind, or have executive dysfunction, I consider them traitors, but there's a fine line between pure cowardice and reasonable fear. I like to think of this situation as akin to the emperor's new clothes. Nobody wants to say that the emperor is naked until a child says so. And because that child says that the emperor has no clothes and nobody is hating him for it, people all agree and are less afraid to point it out. The job of radicals is to be that child. Even if autistic nationalism and autistic pride were grossly wrong, you still need some sort of radicalism so that autistic people don't fear something that randomly comes up, like executive dysfunction theory. But there could also be no good reason to assume that autistic people are more social, except for whatever comes out of every reason combined. Now, even ignoring autistic people and how they treat autistic people, I can tell they lack the creative energy, they lack spirit, they lack what you could call musubi or aura. I mean, they pressured a bunch of innocent mothers into bankrupting themselves into something that, as it turns out, hurts their children. So you would expect them to have very extreme beliefs, but as a matter of fact, they are cultureless. They can insert themselves into any culture or legitimate religion if they are just flexible enough, because they're based on only 2 principles: autistic people bad, behaviorism good. Now, to be fair, these are very extreme beliefs without the constant indoctrination, to put it lightly, from capitalists and behaviorists. But nonetheless, it is worldwide, and it is active. And moreover, the belief in behaviorism is in itself anti-cultural, even if it's disagreeable, because it literally disregards the need for understanding the actual thoughts and feelings of an individual, just outward behavior all the time. Knowing how impure the entire movement was, I know that there would be a divine intervention pretty soon here, but I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. Now, I've already been an off-again, on-again pagan, and so I went to a meeting. Specifically, it was a Wiccan meeting. I'm not particularly Wiccan, but it is nonetheless pagan, so I went to that meeting, and there was this one part where we meditated and we communicated with 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤. Now, in this guided meditation, I had to give up a lot of things. I had to give up the protection, the status, the support, the glory, and so on and so forth. And I even had to take off my sense of self. So I say that 𝘥𝘢𝘵𝘪𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘤 told me this, but if I'm being specific, she didn't say it explicitly, but she made sure that I would at least eventually know what the implication was. 2023 of the Gregorian calendar, sometime between January 2nd and April 4th. There will be one of two things that will happen. The first of which is a lot more simple. Autistic people, specifically autistic nationalists, will take over Autism Speaks. Now, at that point, it won't really be Autism Speaks anymore because the people in charge will be all too conscious of potential autism awareness internalizations and will work to get rid of them. So I guess you can say Autism Speaks would be burned from the inside. Alternatively, there could be a wave of autistic people more terrible than the BLM riots and Capitol riots combined, surrounding Autism Speaks, specifically the DC location. In this event, a team of women shall burn down Autism Speaks, and one way or another, the entire leadership of Autism Speaks will be executed. Now it's worth noting that the latter possibility won't happen on any of the Sabbats or SBOTs because such days are too pure to even think about autism awareness for too long. And for legal reasons, it's worth clarifying that I'm not necessarily advocating for any of this. Rather, I'm just explaining what's going to happen, what the divine forces have already put in place, especially by the goddesses. If the latter situation is true, then a lot of autistic people will inevitably go anonymous and do what they must do. But if you don't want to do crime, then show how well militarized autistic people are becoming. Show how angry and organized autistic people are becoming. Now, I was kind of hesitant to bring you this prophecy because I don't want the war on autism awareness to be characterized as specifically a war for pagans. Instead, it is a war for the faithful in general, against the faithless, cultureless, and almost opinionless behaviorism. This isn't even a war for specifically autistic people, but anyone who opposes the amoral attitudes of autism awareness. When autistic paramilitaries start popping up, autism awareness, especially the bankers, will know that they have little time left, and autistic people will soon have little fear left.